Welcome back, everybody. In this topic, we're going to take a quick look of configuring AAA on an iOS device, which are going to be a router with TACACS for the scope of doing remote user authentication, command authorization, and command accounting at the same time. On the router side, the basic configuration would be to configure the integration with the TACACS server, which would mean to know the IP address of the TACACS server and then configure the pre-share key, which will be used between the router and the TACACS server to basically encrypt the packet. Also, the option is the source interface of the TACACS packet when it's initiated by the router. And we're going to see what would be the use case for that. We also have some other optional settings, like we're going to see when we define it on the ACS side, like something which is called a single connection. Then we will need to define the AA lists, which basically means defining how the authentication would work, the authorization, and the accounting. And then based on the configuration of the AA lists, if we don't use something which is called a default list, then we need to go ahead and apply the custom used list in order to make it work. So now if we go on the router side here, so we're going to choose based on the diagram. What we're going to do is we're going to take R1, which is this one, and we're going to configure it for integration with the ACS server, so that whoever telnets on the device, for example, will get authenticated, authorized, and accounted for through the ACS server. If we go on R1, the first step will basically be to enable the AA new model. Now, you need to understand what happens when you type in this command. So by default, an iOS device uses password-based authentication for the VTI lines. Once you type in the AA new model command, this automatically changes from the password-based authentication to a username password-based authentication. So for example, if I know, let's say first, let's disable it, no AA new model, and let's say telnet 150.1.1.1, I see that it requires a password-based authentication. But once I type in the AA new model command, and then if I say do telnet 150.1.1.1, then it will ask for a username-based password authentication. So you need to understand that the command that you type, what's the end result on the device side. So now let's disconnect from here and disconnect. Let's say disconnect one. And then the next step would be to enable the configuration with the TACACS server. Now there are multiple options you can do that. You can do that through some global commands. You can do that through something which is called an AA group server. We're going to choose the AA group server, which is usually recommended because the old commands, the old global commands will become deprecated. So we're going to go and say AA group server, give it a name. We're using the TACACS protocol, and we say ACS, let's say TACACS. And then if we hit question mark, we can define the server to two options. One is the server command, and one is the server private command. Now, the main difference between using the server option and the server private option is that the server private option allows the ACS server, which is the TACACS server in my case, to be in a VRF, while the server command does not allow you to do that. Additionally, if you use the server command, you cannot configure the key for the server under the AA server group. You still need to use the global TACACS server command to define the key. So I'm going to use the server private option, and I'm going to say that the server private host, so the server private would be 172.16.1.100. This is the IP of the ACS. And then I'm going to say key, let's say Cisco. And I also can say IP TACACS source interface. I'm going to say loopback 0. Now, looking at the diagram, in my case, it doesn't really matter if I use a loopback address as the source of the TACACS packet or not, because R1 has a single path, a single logical path to ACS, which is basically directly connected. But for example, if R1 had multiple paths in the network to reach the ACS server, so basically, let's say that, looking at the diagram, let's say that R1 could reach the ACS server also something like this, so like going this way. then this would mean that based on the routing topology at that moment, when R1 sources the TACACS packet towards the ACS, it can source it either with the IP address of VLAN 19, either with the IP address of VLAN 22. So in that case, because we need to define R1 as the network access device in ACS, when there are multiple paths from the network access device to the ACS server, in that case, you would want to use the loopback address as the source. So in my case, it doesn't really matter, but I just configure it to be the loopback. So I'm going to specify it was the loopback 0, and then I'm going to start defining the AAA authentication list. So now the first one would be the login list. So I first need to enable the login functionality. I can use either the default list or I can use a named authentication list. Now again, you need to be aware of what the impact is if you use a default login list versus a custom named list. Basically, whatever is using a default list, that gets applied to all of the lines of the router. Which means in my case that if I say A authentication login default, then that will affect also the console. So it really depends if you want to affect with your configuration both the console and the VTI lines or only the VTI lines. In my case, I will choose to use a named list, which means that I will have to go and apply that list at the end of the configuration to the VTI lines. So I'm just going to say that the name is, let's say, VTI access. And then I'm going to say that I'm using the group server, which was ACS TACACS, so ACS TACACS. And I'm using the local database as a fallback. And then I also want to define an AA authentication enable list, which again, this time can be only the default one. And I'm going to say group ACS TACACS, and then TACACS local. TACACS, and the second optionality would be I can use either the enable password or the line password. So basically, I will choose to do the enable authentication again using the TACACS server. If the TACACS server is not available in the network, then I want to fail back to either the enable password. In case there is no enable password configured, then I want to use the line password. So this would be the enable authentication. Then I want to say AAA authorization exec. And again, I can use a default one or a named one. I will say the one was named, I'll give it the same name, VTI access. VTI access. And I'm going to say group ACS TACACS, and with a fallback of local. And I also want to enable command authorization, which means authorization commands. If I hit question mark, basically, I can specify for which privilege levels do I want to do command authorizations. Because by default, all of the commands are privilege level 0, 1, or 15. You can either do all of these three, or only do like authorization for commands which are privilege level 15 or 1. So it doesn't make any sense to do command authorization for commands which are at privilege level 5 or 9, because by default there are no such commands at that privilege level. So I'm going to choose and do, for example, privilege level 1, and then I'm going to say group the name, which was VTI access, and then group ACS TACACS, and fallback of local. And I'm going to do the same, for example, for 15 privilege level commands, which is this one, and also let's do it also for the 0 for all of the commands, which is this one. And then I want to specify, I want to do also command accounting. So AAA accounting commands. And again, it's the same functionality, basically because all the commands are 0, 1, or 15. I'm going to do accounting for all three options. So I'm going to say 0, the name would be VTI access, group VTI access, start stop, and then group ACS TACACS, and then local. It doesn't make sense to do local as a fallback, because basically you cannot account locally on the iOS device through the AAA method. That's only available by doing the configuration archive functionality, which is not the case. So I'm going to say that I do remote command accounting for privilege level 0 commands, for privilege level 1 commands, and also for 15. Let's do a show run, section AAA. So now I have the configuration to do command accounting, which is this one, command authorization, exec authorization, enable authentication, and login authentication. Now, because I'm not using the default named list and I'm using the custom named list, in order for this to take effect on the router, I need to go and apply this on the VTI lines or on the console or whatever I want it to be active. In my case, I want it only for the VTI lines, which means I need to go on the VTI configuration. So configure terminal, and then line VTI, let's say 015, and I want to say login authentication, and this would be the name of VTI access, and then I want to say authorization exec was VTI access, and authorization commands, and I want to specify the privilege levels of 0 through VTI access method for 1 and for 15. And I also want to do accounting. So accounting commands, the same, 0 VTI access, this, and then for 1 and for 15. So at this moment, the configuration on the router side is pretty much finished. I want to go on the ACS side and do the integration with the router and configure the command authorization profiles. So first, let's go on the ACS GUI, which would be this one. I want to authenticate with the user of ACS admin and the password of default 1A. Login. So the first thing you need to do, you need to go to network access and add R1 as a network device. You can do that in two options. Either you can specifically add it in here in network devices and AA clients. I'm going to say create. I'm going to give it a name which is R1, and with the IP address of loopback, which is 150.1.1.1. And I'm going to enable it only for TACACS. I'm not using radius with R1, so I'm going to say only TACACS. And the share secret was Cisco. And I say submit. Or you can do the default network device option, which by default is enabled in here, both TACACS and radius. And the shared password, the secret key is shared secret. Basically, what the default network device is used for is used to ease the implementation process. So imagine that you have ACS, you want to do an ACS implementation in the network, and you have like hundreds and thousands of devices you need to enable it in ACS. So instead of having to manually add each network device in ACS database, you can use the default network device and configure, modify, for example, the secret key, the pre-share key in here. And basically, once ACS will get an inbound TACACS or ACS or radius request from a network access device, if it doesn't find it in the network devices and NA clients list, then it will fail back on the default network device. But I choose to manually add it, specifically add it in the ACS database. Now the next step would be to configure some usernames, which will be used for authentication. And I'm going to go to users and identity stores, and I'm going to create, let's say, 2 users. I'm going to say users, and then so I'm going to say create, and I'm going to create a user which is called, let's say, administrator, with a password of Cisco and confirm password of Cisco. Now you have here the enable option, the enable password option. You can choose to specify a different enabled password for the user. Otherwise, it will be the same password as the login password, which I typed into be Cisco. Now, what's not visible in here is that the enabled password is actually usable only by TechX. If you remember back from the ACS 3.x or 4.x, it was actually called the TechX enabled password. What this means is that when the user types in the enable command on the iOS or on the ASA firewall to gain privilege level 15 access, if the router or the ASA firewall uses radius to send that request to ACS, then the ACS will authenticate the user using its login password, so not the enabled password. Only if the network device, which is again the router or the ASA firewall, sends the request to the ACS through TechX, then the enabled password is used. And basically, at that time, the user needs to type in the enabled password to authenticate. So I'm going to leave it the default. I don't want to change it for the moment. I'm going to say submit. And I'm going to create another user, which let's say is restricted. And then I'm going to say the password again of Cisco and Cisco. And for this guy, let's change the enable password to be enable and enable. Submit. So now I've configured, I added R1 as the network device on ACS. I configured two users which are going to be basically used to authenticate when I, for example, telnet on a router on R1. And now I'm going to go and configure the authorization profiles, which means the shell profile, which governs for example, the privilege level assigned to the user session. And I'm going to also define some command authorization sets through which I'm going to allow a user administrator to have full access on the network when it logs in on R1. And I'm going to restrict the user, which is called restricted, to only some of the commands to see how that works. So now let's go to policy elements. And I'm going to say device administration, and I'm going to say shell profiles. Create. The first one would be, I want to give it a name, which would be, again, the administrator. Let's say administrator. Underscore profile shell. And other common tasks, what I can do is I can say what is the default privilege level. I choose to be static. The dynamic option is that you can get that privilege level as a value from an external LDAP server, for example, but I'm using a locally defined value. Let's say I'm using privilege level 1, and I'm also configuring the maximum privilege level, which is static again, and I'm going to say 15. Now, the difference between the default privilege level and the maximum privilege level is that when the user authenticates on the device successfully, it will be assigned the default privilege level, which is 1 in my case. The maximum privilege level is what basically restricts the user when it types in the enabled password, what's the maximum privilege level that it can get access to. I said here 15. But if I would have configured something like 5, then if the user would have typed in an enable 15 command, then that will not be allowed. And next I'm going to say submit for the moment. I don't want to configure any other shell attributes. Submit. And I'm going to configure a new one. Let's say create, which this would be named restricted shell. And I'm going to give this guy access to, so the default privilege level would be, let's say, 5. And the maximum would be as well 15. And submit. Now I'm going to go and configure some command sets. Let's say create. And I'm going to say first the restricted command. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to allow, for example, I want to allow the restricted user to be able to, let's say, configure a router EIGRP and advertise some networks and, for example, use the passive interface command, but nothing else than that. So first of all, I want to allow it access to the enable command because I'm using also privilege level 0 command authorization, so I want to say add. Then let's give it access to show privilege command. So that would be this one. So the user basically is allowed to see its own privilege level. So let's show privilege and then say add. Because I need to be able to configure router EIGRP, then I want to give it access to configure terminal. So configure terminal. You need to be careful when you type in the commands in here because ACS will not validate those commands for you. So if you type in a wrong command or if you type in some kind of spaces in there, then the command will not be functional basically. The configuration will not be functional. So you need to make sure that whatever you type in here is the correct command. And then I want to allow him access to, I said, router EIGRP and say add. And also to the network command and say add. And also to the passive interface command and say add. And I'm going to say submit. At this point, so basically I added R1 as network device. I've configured the users. I've configured the shell profiles for both users. I've configured a restricted command set for only the restricted user. Now what I want to do is I want to go and configure the TACACS policies basically. And we need to go to the access policies. We're going to make use of the default service selection rules, which if we look in there, it says that if an inbound TACACS request is received by the ACS, so if the protocol is matched TACACS, then I'm going to send that request to the default device admin service selection rule. So I'm going to go to the default device admin service selection rule. I first want to make sure that the requests are authenticated through the correct identity, which it is. So basically, at this moment, I know that whatever request will match this access policy, it will be authenticated against the internal user database. You can, if you want to, you can say select and you can modify this. For example, let's say if you'll do something like AD or LDAP integration, and you want to authenticate the users against the AD database or the LDAP database, then you want to go in here and basically change the identity store. You can also configure something which is called an identity store sequence, where, for example, you want to authenticate users against both the AD and the local database. So that's when you would need an identity store sequence, which you'll call it in this configuration in here. And then I'm going to go to the authorization part, where first of all I need to hit the customize button in order to make the command set available to me as an authorization action, and I say OK, because otherwise that will not be available in the authorization policy. And then I want to say create. Let's create a rule for user admin. So at this moment, what I want to do is I want to say something like, if the user is named administrator, then assign this specific authorization profile and this specific command set. If the user is restricted, if the user who's authenticated is the restricted user, then I want to allow him, I want to apply the configured shell profile and the configured command set. But I don't have any, with the default settings, I cannot do that. So the conditions do not allow me, the default conditions do not allow me to specify this based on the user. So what I want to do is I want to go back to the customize option, and I want to say the system username, and I'm going to add that as a valid condition, and I'm going to say OK, and save changes. So now I say create. Give it a name of, let's say, administrator. And then I'm going to say if the system username, so if the user who authenticates is administrator, then I want to allow the shell profile of administrator shell, and the command set, let's say select, and because I didn't configure a command set, I want to go ahead and say, for example, the deny all commands. So in my case, the administrator will have access to no commands at all. I'm going to say OK, and I'm going to say OK. The next rule would be for the restricted user, which is restricted. And I say if the authenticated username is named restricted, then I'm going to grant access as for the restricted shell configuration, and I'm going to assign the restricted command set. Basically, the conditions which you specify here, you can have one or more of this. You can also add further some other conditions if you want to. You just need to make sure that when ACS will parse all the authorization profiles and policies, you uniquely match each session against its own authorization policy. Because now we have, if I say OK in here, I have two authorization policies numbered 1 and 2, and this will be processed top down. It's like an access list, and basically the ACS will stop on first match. And then I want to say save changes. Now let's go back on R1, and let's say I want to telnet to myself, and let's authenticate with the username of administrator first and the password of Cisco. Now I should not be given access to any command, even the show privilege command, which says command authorization failed, and this is because based on my configuration on the ACS, for the user administrator, I attached the deny all commands command set. So even if I say enable, this will not be allowed as well, which is not. Probably even if I say exit, this will not be allowed as well, which is not. So I want to say I want to manually disconnect from this session. And now let's telnet again and authenticate with the user restricted, and the password of Cisco. The show privilege command should work because this was granted to the user. And I was assigned as expected privilege level 5. Now if I say enable, and I try to authenticate with the same Cisco password, then this didn't work because for the user restricted, I've configured a different enabled password, and I'm using TACACS to access privilege level 15, which means I need to type in the enable password, which in my case was actually enable. So let's say enable and the password of enable. And now if I say show privilege, I'm going to get access to 15, which I do. So let's see if I have access to configuring the router EHRP, conft, and say router EHRP 200, let's say. And then network, let's say something like 150.1.1.1, 0, which I can, and passive interface, let's say default. So these were the allowed commands. If I hit question mark, let's say, and let's try and configure, for example, the auto summary command, which should not be allowed, auto summary. Now, the reason why this is allowed probably is, let's do this, but I'm not allowed to do debugs. Let's go back on ACS and let's modify the command set for the restricted user, and let's give it access to debug commands. So let's say, because at this moment, if I say, for example, debug TACACS authorization, this should fail. So let's go and say I get access to debug, to all the debug commands. Debug, and say add. and let's say submit. Now let's go back on the iOS and say debug TACACS authorization, which now should work. And let's go ahead and say configure terminal. Let me see show logging. If it's logging, it's enabled. Let's see. I want to give it access to also say terminal monitor, so I can see the logs live on. I can see the live logs on the console. So also let's say terminal monitor. So terminal monitor. Add, and let's say submit. So let's do terminal monitor, and let's make sure that debugging is enabled, and let's say show logging. So monitor logging is informational. I want to modify this to debugging, let's say. Logging, monitor, debugging. Let's go back to our session, and then let's say configure terminal. And let's say terminal monitor again, terminal monitor, and show privilege command. So router EIGRP 200, and then as I said, I can do the auto summary command. The reason why I can do this is that if I go ahead and I look again on my show run section AAA, is that by default the configure mode commands are not authorized by the router. In order for the router to send for authorization to the ACS to TACACS, the configure level commands, you need to enable that functionality, and that is done with the command which is AAA authorization config commands. So now let's go back to my session, and I want to say configure terminal, and let's say router EIGRP 200, and let's say auto summary. Now this failed. So basically, previously I didn't enforce the command, the configure level commands to be sent to TACACS for authorization. I can also verify that, for example, the exit command is not allowed. So I can also verify if, for example, router BGP, for example, is not allowed, which should not. So this failed again. Now, basically, the difference between doing remote command authorization and local command authorization is that those are no longer tied to the privilege level. So basically, when you do remote command authorization, what you want to do, you want to allow all users the privilege level 15, which is the maximum, so that they actually have access to all commands. But what ends up happening is that when the user types in a command at the CLI, the router will take that command and send it to TACACS for validation, basically asking, is this user allowed to type in this command, yes or no? And then TACACS will basically, based on the configuration and the policies, will say, yes, the user is allowed for that command, or no, the user is not allowed. And you'll see the command authorization failed if the user was not allowed to do that. You can also have, there is some additional command. For example, I didn't enable authentication for the console. So section line console, for example, the console is not authenticated. Show run config. Let's say exit in here. Let's disconnect because I don't have access to the exit command. So show run section line. So I didn't activate the AA configuration for the line console, which means that if I say exit in here, I will not be asked for authentication. Only for the enable, because I'm using the enabled configuration is global. Let's say enabled, and then I want to authenticate with the restricted user and the password of Cisco. So let's say enable and restricted with a password of Cisco. Let's look on the ACS to see what the problem is. So let's go first on the monitoring and reports and launch monitoring and report viewer. And let's go to catalog. And we'll go to a protocol. So let's go first to TechX accounting. Let's go to TechX accounting to see that the commands that the users were configuring were actually accounted for. So let's go to TechX accounting. So I should basically see, if I scroll to the right, that the user restricted typed in some commands which were configure terminal. So let's go here. So the user typed in the configure terminal command, the route to EIGRP, the auto summary command. So basically all the commands were accounted for. Let's go back on the AA protocol and look at the TechX authorization. So this would be the commands that were accounted for, and we see the commands that were allowed basically show up in green. The commands that were restricted based on the assigned command set show up in red. So again, for example, looking in here, it means that the user was allowed to type in route to EIGRP commands, this one, but it was not allowed to type in the auto summary command, or the route to BGP command, or the show running config command based on the assigned command set. Also, let's go back on the A protocol and look at the authentication logs. So the TechX authentication logs. And probably now I should see that I failed the authentication, which I do. This is because I'm typing in the wrong password. I'm typing in actually the password which was used for the user login, not for the enable. So the enabled password was for user restricted. Restricted was actually the enable. So now I'm good. Show privilege. I'm privilege level 15. Let's go and, for example, let's go on the ACS again and configure a command set for the administrator, which would be allowed access to all of the commands. So let's go again to policy elements, command sets, and I want to say create. I want to say administrator command. So I'm given the name of administrator command. And I'm going to say permit any command that is not listed in table below. Basically, this what this does is that it allows access to all of the commands. So I'm going to say submit, and I need to go to the access policies, to the authorization sets. And then for the administrator rule, I want to change the command authorization, the command set. I'm going to say deselect and select. And I want to apply the new one, which is this one. And I say OK. OK, and save changes. Now I want to go back on the router, and I want to say exit. And let's say enable. And I will authenticate with the administrator user, with the password of Cisco, and then show privilege, and I'm privilege level 15. So the problem with the console, although the console, if looking again at the console, show run, section line, although I didn't apply any kind of AA configuration for the console, it's only applied on the VTI lines. If I go and say show run, section AAA, the problem is that the enable method does not support a non-default functionality. So basically, all of the other configurations, which are the authentication, the exec authorization, the command authorization, command accounting, I gave those lists a name, and I applied the name only on the VTI lines. But as I said initially, whatever is used as the default list, then that gets applied to all of the lines, which means including the console. So basically, with this option, I actually configured the enable authentication on the console. What I wanted to show you additionally is that by default, the console does not do command authorization. So basically, if I do, let's go ahead and say exit. And let's authenticate again with the user restricted. And then the enabled password, which was enabled. And show privilege. I can basically do pretty much anything. I can say router BGP 201, because by default, so based on the configuration set of the user restricted, I should not be allowed to do this. But by default, the console does not enforce command authorization. This is basically seen as a fail safe mechanism, so you don't get yourself locked out of the console if you erroneously configure the command authorization set. But you can enforce the authorization also on the console by using a specific command, which is, so let's say exit, and let's log in again with the user administrator and the password of Cisco. You can enforce that using the command AAA authorization console, which this is again a global command. So now if I exit and I authenticate again with the user restricted, so enable and restricted with the enable password of enable. Now if I say conft and I say router BGP 200, I should not be allowed to do this. Well, it says 201. Let's say router OSPF 20, which still I am allowed to do that. Let me see. The reason I am allowed to do that is because by looking again at the configuration of the authorization for the commands, those are not using a default list. Those are using a named list. So in order to enforce that, I should actually go at the console and apply the AA authorization commands sets. So let's go and say, let's exit. Let's say show run section AAA, section line actually. And I want to apply the same command authorization sets also for the console. So I want to say line console 0. I want to apply the authorization commands, which is this. So I want to do this. Let's exit, and let's say already I see that I get authorization failed command because I'm using the user of restricted. So now if I say configure terminal, I no longer have, let's say this one. So at this moment I kind of locked myself out because I don't have access to the exit command. Let's go to the command set and allow access for the restricted command to the exit command. So let's say exit. And add, and let's say submit. And let's go back on the router and say exit. Now it should be allowed, not yet. So now we've seen the authorization process with the different authorization command sets being applied based on the user who's authenticated on the router. And as I said, the AA authorization console command, which is a global command, which is this one, AA authorization console, enables the authorization for the users being authenticated at the console. By default, this is disabled, and this is seen like a fail-safe mechanism, so you kind of don't get yourself locked out of the console. So by default, all of the authorizations that you configure do not apply for the console unless you type in this command. Now, whenever you work with AAA on the router and trying to enable the AA functionality, in order not to lock yourself out of the router, it's good to, for example, work with the reload in command. So try not to save the configuration, work on the config, paste the configuration, but not save it, test it to see if it works, and for example, use the reload in option, like reload in 20. So basically at this point, what will end up happening is that the router will reload itself in 20 minutes from this point. So basically, what this means is that the AA configuration will not be applied after the router reload, so I don't get myself locked out of the router in that point.